ensure that our event runs smoothly. First, kindly silence your mobile phones to avoid any interruption during the lecture, and please turn on your web camera. Secondly, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please save your questions for that time. Today's lecture is reflection on the possibilities and limits of regional development on indigenous rights discourse in ASEAN. As fellow member of ASEAN, Indonesia and the Philippines share similarities in cultural diversity and the legal protection of indigenous rights. This makes for a very interesting topic for further study, especially in the field of law. Since then, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Ms. Maria Roda Cisnero. Is a renowned expert from School of Law Ateno University. We are very fortunate to have her this morning to share her insight and knowledge with us. Let me read her short curriculum vitae. Mrs. Cisnero graduated from Erasmus University Rotterdam and Ateno School of Law. Besides being an academician, she also has some experiences at the Asia Foundation Save for Kids PH, International Justice Mission, and Legal Assistance Center for Indigenous Filipinos, or PANLIPI. Correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am. Well, without any further ado, I welcome Ms. Cisnero to give her lecture. 20 minutes, is it okay?
Okay.
The screen and time is yours, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Madam, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Let me try to share my screen and we start from there. Okay. Wait, let me just fix it. So I hope if you cannot hear me, just let me know. So are you familiar with Mentimeter? Can you go to can you use your mobile phones, everyone? And then go to menti.com, or you can also just take a photo of the QR code. Can you try to do that? Okay. So very quickly, I'll try to get to know everyone, even if we don't have time to personally meet each other. Okay, I'm beginning to see 16 students. Very good. So please come in. Try to go to menti.com and then enter the code 3374-9019. If you cannot, another option is for you to just take a photo of the QR code. Okay, 29, 30. I'll start as soon as, okay, catch up everyone. Try to go to menti.com. Okay, the first question. Are you familiar with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? So just choose no knowledge, or you know something about it because you took it in one subject, right? Okay, so some a little bit, most so far have no knowledge. That's okay, because we will go over it. As I speak, I would be able to say that Indonesia is a signatory to the declaration. Okay, so someone has heard of it, but they want broader knowledge on the topic. Okay, so others have also really heard about it, but most of you are really leaning on a little bit, heard about it, but have not studied. So that's what we'll do this morning. study the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for a bit. Okay. Next slide. Now, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words Indigenous peoples? Anything. It can be in your mother tongue, it can be in Bahasa Indonesia. If it's in your other regional languages and I don't understand it, it's okay, just put it there. Okay, one response, native, that's true. Local, that's also another way of looking at indigenous peoples. There you go. I have not memorized this, but thank you for mentioning it. Masyarakat adat. I hope I said it properly. In Filipino or in Tagalog, we say katutubong Pilipino. In my other regional language, we say nainsigudan nga umili, right? But yes, in Indonesia, it's now officially often referred to as masyarakat adat. Native people, local, daira. What does it mean? Does it stand for native as well? Culture, yes. We think of culture when we hear words about indigenous people. So you know how the cloud works, right? The bigger the letters, that means more people are choosing that term. Okay, so that's just really my super short introduction. I think the last slides, thank you for the emojis. I appreciate it. Aside from the emojis, you can also leave some questions. Okay. But usually as a teacher, I actually really ask my students to, what are the three emojis in your, what are the last three emojis that you use today? So it often tells me the mood of the students, right? So this is good to see. I even see Santa Claus. Christmas is a very big holiday in the Philippines. I see lollipop, flowers, angels. Okay, we'll have more of that. My student loves emojis as well, right? Which is a language in itself. So what are we going to do this morning? Very, very briefly, we'll really reflect on something. Can we really talk about regional indigenous people's rights in the ASEAN? And the other bigger question will be, can Indonesia, in the process, lead the way? Why am I asking it that way? One, it's a lecture for students in Jakarta. Second of all, because the main office of the ASEAN is actually in Jakarta. I've been to Jakarta twice, all because, and on two occasions, work-related for the ASEAN. But hopefully, I can also go to Jakarta or other parts of Indonesia for a holiday or maybe to visit the university. We can say that there are many indigenous peoples in the ASEAN. There are really, but we cannot really provide a good number because most of the nation states do not include this in the census. Okay, so almost always, these are just approximations. Even in the Philippines, even if we already have a law recognizing indigenous people's rights, the official census that will just officially allow us to understand the number of indigenous peoples in the Philippines has just begun. We always say it should be around 15 million in the Philippines, right? Something that is common to us, Philippines and Indonesia, is that we're an archipelagic nation. But I've always really been in awe at the thought that, because in the Philippines, we only have one time zone compared to yours where you have several time zones. Okay, I got this from a map, just really to quickly indicate the number of ethno-linguistic groups in Indonesia. to be very technical about it, we don't necessarily equate ethno-linguistic groups to indigenous peoples, okay? But almost always, this is a good start in trying to figure out or trying to map indigenous populations. Okay. They say that approximately about 100 million people identify as indigenous in Southeast Asia. Indigenous people's rights activists, though, say that they approximate around 50 to 70 million indigenous peoples in Indonesia. So if you look at that in terms of number, the bigger population, even in approximation, of indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia are actually in Indonesia. Okay. We know, however, that within the region, right, indigenous peoples and human rights are very sensitive topics, right? Because culturally and also politically, even as a regional bloc, when we talk about the ASEAN, the default has always been non-interference. So this is a sensitive topic, but at the same time, because the ASEAN nation, even as early as 2020, already started talking about indigenous peoples. As law students, as scholars, it's also good to really look at it. It's really good to also problematize, okay, if you are talking about it, how far along are you in terms of these conversations? So for instance, around sometime in 2000, is it 2000? Sometime in for the declaration covering 2001 to 2010, for instance, or in 2018, for instance, the guidelines on promoting responsible investment in food, agriculture, and forestry, adopted in October 2018, for the first time, explicitly mentioned the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the ILO Convention. This document and this guideline is not law, it's not a declaration, just a guideline, also mentioned free, prior, and informed consent. And pre-pandemic, this is a big development. Let's look at it again. So is there an ASEAN declaration? Technically none, no, on indigenous peoples. This is a video that we won't have time to watch, but this is a video that tries to capture the key features of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm going to leave a copy of my lecture to the Secretariat, and they will share this one. So I'm encouraging you to watch the video on your own after the lecture. Looking at it further, right? So what is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? It was a declaration which is a big deal in 2007. It was adopted with 144 votes in favor, 11 abstention, and 4 states against it. So did an ASEAN member state abstain? No. How did the Philippines, Indonesia, and Indonesia vote? They voted in favor of the declaration. Okay. US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States in 2007 opted not to adopt it. But after several years, they slowly adopted it. And we know why it took them a while, right? Because they have their relationship with Aboriginal peoples and indigenous peoples are also very, very sensitive, considering that these countries are what we call settler states, right? There were white people who colonized those lands, and there are now more white people in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States than the Native Americans or the indigenous populations. Okay. Next slide. If we look at the ASEAN, you will see that, okay, Brunei signed it, as I said, they all signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a good thing, right? But now when we ask further, that was in 2007. It will be 20 years old by 2027. That's roughly 4 years away from now. As a non-legally binding document, what are nation states supposed to do about it? Ideally, it should also recognize, it's still really something very persuasive, and ideally, it could really be a basis for domestic law. So we ask further, are there domestic law equivalents in ASEAN member states recognizing indigenous people's rights? Right now, you would notice that Brunei and Singapore are blank. Why is that? Well, technically, even the closest thing to a comprehensive report, one, they maintain that they do not have indigenous peoples, and even the working group on indigenous peoples tend to leave Brunei and Singapore when they prepare reports. So it's blank. They're just silent about it. Cambodia, it's not mentioned in their constitution to date, and there's no equivalent domestic law. In Indonesia, you have their constitution looking at Article 18b2. I'll talk about it very briefly again later on. And I trust that some of you are familiar with it in relation to natural resources and land rights. In Laos, the concept, they say, is not recognized by the government. In Malaysia, for the Orang Aslis, among others, the governing law remains to be a very old law, which is the Aboriginal Peoples Act of 1954. What's wrong with a 1954 law? It's very, very old, and also the assumption here is that it's strongly assimilationist. What's that supposed to mean? Laws that are assimilationist tend to say, we are one nation, and if you want to have rights, you have to talk, drink, eat, live like us. You have to assimilate with the mainstream culture. So this is technically, even if the domestic law is here, this is really outdated, which goes against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In Myanmar, they also maintain the position that all citizens of Myanmar are indigenous. Okay, so these are very political positions. Okay, in the Philippines, so even before 2007, we already mentioned the indigenous cultural communities in the 1987 Constitution, and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was enacted in 1997. It is also highly inspired by then the draft Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Thailand, very political position as well. It does not officially recognize the existence of indigenous peoples. In Vietnam, there is partial recognition since 1992. So, big picture, it's good to note that ASEAN member states signed the UN DRIP, that they supported it, okay? But we have a long way to go in terms of at least further developing or creating follow-throughs through domestic law. Okay, so this is a screen capture of a report I got from the working group on indigenous peoples, right? So it says here that approximately 260 million people with 1,331 ethnic groups. Of course, not all are indigenous, right? But the National Organization of Indigenous Peoples, Aliansi Masyarakat Adat, Nusantara, Aman, estimates that the number of indigenous peoples in Indonesia is between 50 to 70 million. That is really a very rough estimate, right? 20 million room for error is a lot. But it's also a reflection that within the ASEAN, there are really, we have yet to really properly conduct census in terms of indigenous peoples. It's also not easy to count indigenous peoples because until and unless you better define it in your domestic law, your statistics office or the census won't be able to properly account for it, right? In the Philippines, there are over 119 ethno-linguistic groups. Your report indicates that there are over 250 languages spoken by indigenous Papuans alone. That's really a lot. So, but is it safe to say that the students in this room speak more than just 2 languages? Like if you speak more than 2, using the emojis in your Zoom, like if you speak more than 2 languages. Okay, I want to see if you, who speaks more than 5 languages using the like emoji? Anyone? Okay. So why is it difficult? So even if the ASEAN member states already signed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, why is it difficult to recognize it? Or even for one, it can be very political, right? This is why it's not surprising to see here ASEAN member states say, we're all indigenous. We're all Lao, right? Because that's supposed to be, in the context of the rise of nation states, your core identity already. So what makes a person now indigenous? The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples did not strictly define it. So in the context of the Philippines, and reflecting on that, what we had to do, or what my mentors had to do, was to define indigenous peoples. So this is the definition of indigenous cultural communities / indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So look at the elements here. It refers to a group of people or homogeneous societies identified by self-ascription and ascription by others. This is a very important element of identity. You can either identify and say we are, as a community, as a society, indigenous. It's called self-ascription. Or it can be ascription by others. Okay, by saying that, can you just easily say you're indigenous? Not necessarily, because you have to connect it to the other part of the definition. Who have continuously lived as organized community, okay, on communally bounded and defined territory, and who have under claims of ownership since time immemorial. So that's the tricky thing. You have lived continuously together as a community since time immemorial, occupying, possessing, and utilizing territories, common bands of language, customs, traditions, and other cultural traits. Another element that had to be included in the definition: what if you no longer stay in your land because a mining company entered the picture? It can still be a community who have through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-Indigenous religions and cultures became historically differentiated from majority of the Filipinos. So here, yes, of course, we all look Asian. Of course, we all look Malay, perhaps, right, in the Philippines. But what would make the distinction? These communities and the indigenous peoples in the Philippines are historically differentiated because they were not colonized or they managed to resist colonization. I studied in The Hague, in the Netherlands, for my master's. And you know, in the Netherlands, they claim to have good Indonesian food. I'm sure you will not agree. But they have very good peanut butter and very good satay. And I'm sure it's because of the Dutch history of colonizing. It's something they learned when they were in Indonesia. I would always say, what's your favorite peanut butter? The one in the Netherlands, which is weird, right? Because what do they know about peanut butter? They probably learned it from somewhere else. But ultimately, this is what makes indigenous peoples. A big element of that is that they managed to resist politically, socially, and culturally inroads of colonization. Okay, what else? What if, again, as I mentioned, what if they were displaced? Still, if they still have some elements within the definition, they can still really be considered indigenous cultural communities or indigenous peoples. Okay, let's try to watch this short video very, very briefly. No, I don't think we have time for the video, but I would encourage you to watch this. This is the 10th anniversary video of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in that video, they were saying the changes that happened in their respective countries after the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They did not feature an Indonesian indigenous person in that video, but in retrospect, after 2007, after the UN DRIP, one of the biggest developments really in Indonesia would be, in the context of indigenous people's land rights, would be the Constitutional Court's decision ruling in favor of sorry, I cannot read my own slides, ruling in favor of a man, right? So they filed a lawsuit and the court decided that that forest is not state forest. And thus, the state has to respect customary land ownership, including that of land not in permanent use. Okay, so this is a good win in relation to land rights. Okay, here, if I may quote, Judge Muhammad Alim of the Constitutional Court said that indigenous Indonesians have the right to log their forest and cultivate the land for their personal needs and the needs of their families. So this is in 2013, roughly 7 years after the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So you would assume that, this is 10 years. This is technically 10 years ago. What happened after that, right? When is the domestic law coming? Okay, so 10 years after that, you still do not have an enabling law. What would be interesting in the context of the Philippines is we had the enabling law first before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So what would be the answer? How come there's no law yet? Because it can be controversial. It's not easy to advocate for the domestic equivalent on a law recognizing indigenous people's rights. Why is that? I'll very quickly walk you through Philippine law for you to understand why. One, no, even if the bill has been filed over and over again, some of your politicians will still say, no, we can't do that. We cannot give all those rights to indigenous Indonesians. In the context of the Philippines, they must have filed the bill for at least 4 times. So it took the Philippine advocates and indigenous communities around 10 to 12 years to advocate for the law. Right? So in a way, legal advocacy and laws that require major changes can really take time. It takes time. Okay? So here's another animation, but I'm going to skip it, but also encouraging you to read it, to watch it after this lecture. Okay, so why is it difficult to now really enact domestic law? Okay, so for countries that refuse to recognize indigenous peoples, they'll continue to pretend there are no indigenous peoples, right? But for countries already recognizing it, right, it can still be really a protracted journey. Why is that? Because reflecting on the Philippine experience, to create a domestic law is to correct historical injustice. It would also mean really better enforcing constitutional mandates and now really saying we are now again adopting international norms in our local jurisdiction. It's easy to embrace culture. It's easy to wear textile made of indigenous clothing, right? But the moment we talk about land, ancestral domains, it becomes very tricky, right? If you are not an indigenous person, 1,000 hectares of land or 100 acres of land is a lot already. But if you look at indigenous people's rights claims to land, it can cover one municipality. It can cover practically 2 provinces. It can cover 2 mountains, maybe a mountain range. And that is something in the context of the state difficult to imagine. So ideally though, in the example, our laws here in the Philippines now, there is already such a thing as a law that officially allows indigenous peoples to start processing their ancestral domains. But what if an indigenous community says, we don't want to go through that land tithing process? That's still valid. They still own the land because of native title, right? So if the indigenous cultural community says, okay, delineation can be very, very expensive. We don't want to do that anymore. What are the features on ancestral lands and domains, traditional use, and the sustainable development plan? Often, if you are in the city, you would tend to say, or some of your politicians would say, indigenous peoples, they do not like development. You have to share the land to the population. That's true. And indigenous peoples and advocates would say that we are not saying that we will own the land on our own and we will refuse to share it with the community. It's just that it is important to us that lands, when developed, are now included in what we call sustainable development and protection plan. You can't just mine mountains left and right. We really have to factor in sustainability and the protection plan. And that can be really an issue of major debates. Why, too, is land rights very difficult in relation to indigenous people's rights, regardless of jurisdiction? Because there are other laws involved, like say your conservation laws, What else? Other land rights of perhaps other vested interests. And there are other government programs. Customary law. Okay, so we leave land rights behind. Our Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act also recognizes customary law. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also puts a premium on ancestral lands and customary law. Here now you're able to say that the primary of customary laws and practices should be considered. What else? It recognizes as well Indigenous people's right to self-governance and empowerment. One of the most contentious provisions is what we call free and prior informed consent. Why is this controversial? Because this is where power comes in. This is when now you say, what if a government project decides to say, we want to use a portion of your indigenous land. We want to move the capital. We want to put up a hydroelectric power plant, which it will now really touch a portion of your ancestral land. And here, through the UN Declaration, and at least in the local law of the Philippines, before a project can come in, it should at least get the free and prior informed consent of the community. So usually in our experience, the local legislation it becomes controversial because some of the representatives and the members of Congress would refuse to recognize free and prior informed consent. If you look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it did not use the word consent. It only used the word free and prior informed consultation. It was a compromise that they had to make, if only to push for the declaration. What else are the features? What else are the features of the Philippine law, which is also a feature of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN? Social justice and human rights. This is now, and it goes beyond just land rights now, because now it would reiterate non-discrimination, equality. Even if you say that these are natives, that they are uneducated, equality before the law matters. That's where the assumption is there. They have rights during armed conflict, rights for women, children, and youth, equal protection, and fundamental human rights. What else? Your UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also the Philippine counterpart provides premium on cultural integrity. When cultural integrity, it also says that to the extent possible, Indigenous knowledge systems and practices should be recognized, including IP education schools. So if the young people would rather study in their mother tongue, the state should provide resources that will allow. What else? Why then is the rights of Indigenous peoples important? It comes with symbolic dimension too, in the context of right to religion, cultural rights and ceremonies. Also to teach, have access, use, control to ceremonial objects, repatriation of human remains, and also respect for sacred places. So for instance, a mining corporation now says, most of the gold that we need are in that mountain. We want to use it. But if the community says you cannot touch that mountain because that mountain is sacred to us, then you cannot, right? So this is where free and prior informed consent can be tricky all over again, because a community may value a specific site differently from how you value it. So here is a photo of finally in 2022, our Philippine Statistics Authority is systematically starting to really generate and gather accurate indigenous peoples statistics in the Philippines. What else are there? I mentioned that already. Technical dimensions, indigenous knowledge systems and practices, literature, design. And these laws are important because it's important to the survival of indigenous populations in the Philippines, in Jakarta, in Indonesia, and in the ASEAN region, right? Because now it's not really about colonizing communities. It's really about it's now about self-determination, continuous operation of their own system, freedom and ability to chart their fate and decide among options of change. Now, if Indonesia is to learn from the Philippines, one of the things that I would say would be learning from the creation of a national office. In the more than 20 years experience of a domestic law in the Philippines, what has become its weakest point is an NCIP, a national commission that has been at the mercy of politicians and politics. So what could have been a primary agency of government or the state to take care of IPs has been pressured and has been weakened through the years in terms of budget, political pressure, to really consider other interests and powers. Okay, so let's look very briefly at the Indonesian experience again. No? So according to AMAN activists, until recently, their most important task was working on a national law, right? But I would also now say, preparing this lecture, that maybe it's okay not to rush a national law, right? Learning from the Philippine experience, no? So when they realized that, okay, we cannot seem to get the recognition on national scale, what they did is started working as political forces and as a national organization locally. Okay, if we cannot get recognition on a national scale just yet, we will try to get local registration, right? So one of my last slides would be this, right? A photo before pandemic of your president handing over land certificates to a representative of an indigenous group. Okay. And this is a good start to the right direction. Look at how international communities are also there. Because ultimately, and this is where my last, and we go to the ASEAN. If Indonesia ultimately recognizes, domestically recognizes its indigenous communities as a leader in the ASEAN region, it will also open more doors and also inspire and challenge other ASEAN member states to recognize their own indigenous peoples. Remember that in terms of populations, the bulk of indigenous populations in the ASEANs are actually in your archipelago. Here is a very quick trivia about the ASEAN. That logo actually stands for stalks of rice paddies. Yeah, believe it or not, they're supposed to be rice. Because it's something that we all share, right? Love for rice. But of course, aside from being colonized by many varied West European countries, I'm really, really convinced that we share so much more than just the love for rice. Okay, this is my last slide. So in my regional languages, we say maraming salamat. Thank you very much. In Northern Philippines, we say Diyos tiagnina. And in Bicol region, it's Diyos mabalos. I will open the floor for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cisnero, for your comprehensive explanation. Well, perhaps we can continue this further in an interfaculty collaboration project, right? We will be delighted if you visit Jakarta and to our faculty, and we can accompany you to tourist spots in Jakarta, especially to Taman Mini Indonesia Indah, where you can witness a wide array of cultural diversity from various indigenous communities in Indonesia. Well, are there any questions for Ms. Cisnero? I will give the opportunity to the first three participants. I will open the floor to the participants to give some questions to Ms. Cisnero. Well, there is Ibu Kunti Tridewiyanti. Ibu Kunti Tridewiyanti herself is one of our lecturer Hukum Adat, Ibu Kunti.
Yeah. Hello, Miss Maria.
Yeah.
Thank you for presentation and for lecture. Yes, guest lecture in Pancasila University. So I concern with the bills, bills of masyarakat adat. I mean, it's masyarakat adat bills. So, can you explain more about how to advocate about your bill? I mean, the Philippine bills about indigenous people, because this is very interesting. Yes, thank you, Ms. Maria.
According to my teachers, when they were, as I said, it took them 10 to 12 years to push for it.
Yeah.
They had to really look for very good champions. In the Philippines, we have a Senate and a Congress, right? So in the Senate, they found a really passionate advocate. And then in Congress, they managed to find several advocates as well. And during that Congress, they got lucky. There were good people who were ready to push for it. So in terms of timing, after filing it over and over again, that Congress became really an important factor. Ultimately, of course, even when it was passed as a law, some indigenous communities were not happy about it. Because towards the end, for it to pass at that time, they had to make compromises, right? So one of the compromises would mean also losing certain things, right? Like, for instance, Baguio City will never be an ancestral land. Baguio City is like Bandung, like summer capital, very cold. There are a lot of indigenous peoples there. But the senators were pressuring the advocates. If you want this to move forward, you have to agree that Baguio will remain Baguio. It will not be an ancestral land, or it will not be an ancestral domain. So there were compromises made. So I think because the indigenous communities in Indonesia have been advocating for it regionally and locally as well, it matters that when you already find your champions as advocates, and very diverse at that, your non-negotiables and negotiables should be very clear. Because even when our law was passed, one of the first things that they who were against it did was to file a case at our constitutional court questioning the constitutionality of the law. But ultimately, it was still declared constitutional. So I guess knowing the negotiables and non-negotiables of the communities advocating for the national law is very important.
Okay. Thank you so much. Maybe the second, because the second questions, I want to know about the adat courts in your bills. Can you explain it about how the situation about the adat courts? Yes.
So
Thank you.
customary law,
Yeah.
customary law now applies only within the communities. And
yeah.
so technical, and of course, the Philippine justice system is also plural in the sense that we have our Sharia courts, which is a separate process altogether. But for customary law, the law decided to leave it upon the communities on how they will put it together, because it should really be well within their indigenous knowledge and practices. What happens now if indigenous peoples within that community, in the context of land, are not happy about a decision? That's when they can go to state court to appeal. Yes. So that has been, so it starts, ideally you settle it amongst yourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then you get, you're not happy about the settlement, it goes to the state court.
Okay. So thank you, Miss Maria. I hope someday you will come to Indonesia and visit Pancasila University.
Yes, I would take it as an invitation, and hopefully someday I can, when I visit Jakarta again, I can make time to visit the university as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Kunti. And there are two questions from our students, Mrs. Cisnero. First from Safira Diva Anissa Rangkuti. She wrote, Miss Maria, allow me to ask about customary law. Does ASEAN still apply customary law for each country or not at all? And the second is from Jessica Kali. Kali, kamu mau menanyakan sendiri ke Ibu Maria? Please.
Okay, hello Miss Maria. My name is Jessica Kelly, and I want to ask about issue concerning indigenous people in Indonesia range from land conflict, recognition of indigenous people, and the protection to human rights defender. In your opinion, are this problem could be arises since we still don't have the same understanding of the concept of indigenous people in Indonesia, Miss?
Okay, I'll answer customary law first, and then I'll answer the conflicting rights and conflicting claims vis-a-vis definition of indigenous peoples. Because we were colonized, right? Except for Thailand, right? We really have mixed laws. Ones that were developed for the nation state, by the colonizers that ultimately made it to our domestic law. And then, of course, in the knowledges and practices that are observed regionally or through ethno-linguistic groups. So within the ASEAN, even the ASEAN Declaration on Human Rights recognize customary law. Now, when it comes to definition, you would notice that even the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples refused to define indigenous peoples. And that's why in my lecture, I had to use what has become the definition of the Philippine law in indigenous peoples. And if you look at the elements, you can already imagine how that kind of definition can create conflict, right, between many varied groups. One of the things, when a nation decides to slowly recognize land rights, boundary dispute will come to play. And can you imagine hundreds of indigenous communities fighting over boundaries, right? Or even better, defining who will be a member of this indigenous community or not. And this is where self-ascription comes in. So yes, defining it forms part of the problem, but it's a necessary discussion and problem that should be negotiated and problematized. I hope the answer helps, even if it confirms more problems.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Miss Maria.
You're welcome.
Is there any question from the participants? I gave the opportunity for the two participants who want to ask to Miss Cisnero. Probably from the lecturer from the Faculty of Law of Pancasila University. Well, maybe
I would like to ask a
okay.
question to Miss Maria. So you are talking about the indigenous people, right? So actually my question is simple, like how do we protect indigenous people rights nowadays? Although some countries have taken constitutional and legislative measures to recognize their rights and identity exclusion towards their safety. I mean, we can't deny like there is any violations towards the indigenous people. So how do we solve the problems?
Recognizing indigenous peoples, be it locally or nationally, is a very good start to really protect indigenous people's rights. If we leave the ASEAN jurisdiction, if you look at Canada now, for instance, one of their ways to also that way we also look at other experience. Reconciliation has been important to them. Recognizing and apologizing for the past mistakes has become really critical in the national conversation of Canada and New Zealand in relation to indigenous peoples. Very recently, over the weekend, Australia, for instance, they had a plebiscite because the indigenous communities there were saying, we have to change Australian constitution. You have to at least mention us there. We have to be recognized. But that plebiscite did not turn out to their favor. Majority of the Australians refused to vote yes, right? So even in other jurisdictions, reconciliation as a form of protection is very, very important. I think in the ASEAN, what would be contested is by default land rights. We are lucky in the Philippines, Indonesia, we did not lose our language. We still have many varied regional languages. If you go to Spain, South America, a lot of indigenous communities there only speak Spanish because they lost their mother tongue. So culturally, protecting the culture is also very important. So indigenous education is a good way of supporting that.
Okay, is there any question? If not, I'm going to ask to Miss Cisnero. Well, since you mentioned about the IP rights, is it intellectual property, Miss Cisnero?
Sorry, for this lecture, of course, IP rights means intellectual property, but
Yes.
also here, indigenous peoples.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, but what would be the equivalent concept, legal concept of IP, intellectual property for indigenous peoples? That would be IKSP, indigenous knowledge, indigenous knowledge and practices, IK, indigenous knowledge, science and practices. So it's roughly equivalent to intellectual property.
Well, I've ever heard about the intellectual property rights itself must be covered about the indigenous communities, sites, or knowledgements, or like status, like whatever it is. What do you think about that?
So for instance, what would be good example is what I'm wearing right now, right? So hand woven is a shared tradition within the ASEAN. But can you imagine H&M or big global brands like Zara copying this one without paying now indigenous communities who may have designed it? Cultural misappropriation. So there's a big gap there right now. And there are a lot of indigenous communities, artisans and weavers who are beginning to really find their way. That way they can also protect their customs, right, in weaving. So in Mindanao, for instance, in South Cotabato, a community applied for intellectual property to protect their traditional form of weaving. But what you get is not an intellectual property for an individual, for one person. It becomes an intellectual property for the community. So at least right now, we're beginning to see attempts to do that.
So the community itself, can they ask their rights in the form of compensation, which give to them by their country, or just delivering direct to their communities?
So this one, in the experience of the weavers, they had to go to the intellectual property office. They applied for intellectual property protection, but now the use of their woven materials are shared by the community. So it becomes something that is shared as well in terms of income. Even permitting process now cannot be decided by just one person. It still should be decided by the weavers as a community.
Well, such a quiet, interesting explanation from Mrs. Cisnero. Is there any question before I close this lecture?
Yes, I have a question, ma'am.
From M. Ali. Do you want to speak to Mrs. Cisnero yourself?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned before about this topic, the indigenous rights, how it becomes so sensitive in the Asian countries, and I still do not understand how such a noble cause become so sensitive to be talked about. How is that? Would you explain briefly so I can understand? Thank you.
If you look at New Zealand or Australia, it's easy to say who is the white Australian and the non-white Australian. So it's easy to also historically differentiate that, oh, these are the Aborigines and they've always been there, and then we arrive because of discovery. So in that experience, as a country, it's easy to define who is an indigenous person, right? Within the ASEAN, despite our diversity, while we celebrate and recognize diversity, it's easier for some nation state to just politically say that we're one and the same, everyone, instead of really recognizing that some may have been historically differentiated. Another good example would be Japan. There are indigenous peoples in Japan, But from the ASEAN lens, you would think that, oh, they're all Japanese, right? But at least Japan recognizes that they have Ainus and they are indigenous peoples. So that's one aspect of what makes it sensitive. What they would want to happen is that, okay, we have one identity. We're all members of this republic, period, right? And that is in part also inspired by colonization, because then the assumption was, you want to have rights, you have to assimilate. But now, fast forward 2020, 2010, self-determination has become an important feature of human rights. But self-determination for authoritarian regimes can also be very tricky, right? Because that would mean many communities having different opinions. So that makes it sensitive. And then you add another layer within the ASEAN, we put a premium on non-interference. So those are layers of sensitivities that we navigate. I hope that answers the question in part.
So basically, can I say that it becomes sensitive because of the colonization per se, or?
That has contributed to it, right?
All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
So,
thank you.
Because colonization would say, oh, okay, like when you hear the Philippines, how come, look at my name, it's very Spanish, Maria, Cisnero, right? My grandparents lost access to our local names, right? But it doesn't make me Spanish. But I also know I'm not indigenous, right? But that I know because I've been Christianized. So that's another layer too. But it becomes sensitive most of all because of land rights. Because imagine mining communities or developments, right? I'm sure there are big development projects that require vast tracts of lands. If you look now, where are the vast tracts of land? Most of them are in indigenous communities or where indigenous populations live. So that's another layer to why it is sensitive.
Enough, Ali, or do you have any other question?
All right, that's pretty clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. If there are any question from the students?
I would like to ask some question. Can I?
Yeah, the last question from Nurlita Puspitasari. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, in your opinion, Ms. Maria, is there a qualification or something that land or place can be said there is still an indigenous community? Because you explained about place the land, there is still a community, indigenous community. So in your opinion, is there any qualification or something they aspect into it?
The qualification often would be time immemorial possession. So in land titles, right, regardless of jurisdiction, for non-indigenous people, sometimes you have to show that, oh, my family, we've been possessing and using this land for 30 years. Everybody in this village knows that this parcel of land is owned by my family. In the context of indigenous peoples, it cannot just be 10 years, 30 years. Ideally, they have to historically indicate that they have what we call, quote unquote, time immemorial possession of the land. Even before the Dutch came, our ancestors were already using these mountains. That kind of definition. Or in the context, for instance, of the photo, right? Some of the indigenous communities there are actually indigenous communities who managed to resist Dutch rule, right? So they kept on moving. Why are they in the mountains, you ask? How come they're not near the waters anymore, except for the Bajau, right? Because when the Dutch or the colonizers in the Philippines or the colonizers in Indonesia came, they started using agricultural land, right? And the ones who resisted colonization went to the mountains to avoid contact with them. So that's one form, one way of showing time immemorial possession.
Okay, enough. Thank you, Miss Maria.
Okay, I think there is one more question, Miss Maria. This is from our student Ziza. Let me read for you. Morning, Miss Maria. Please allow me to ask, is there a concrete proof like an identity card to show that you are a part of an indigenous community, especially for the people who may have resettled outside of their ancestral domain?
Okay, so resettlement is another element. If you look at the definition in the Philippine law, right, or even in the reference to the UN Declaration, well, one, you don't have to have an ID. There are, in fact, a lot of indigenous communities who do not even have a birth certificate, right? So technically, an ID, the commission will not look for an ID. But what if they have been displaced? What are still the common markers? Language, customs, traditions, and their other indigenous knowledge and practices. So those will be the markers. And how they live, right? Almost always communally, right? So that's one way. And of course, at least an elder would still be able to remember, we used to live in that mountain until we were asked or forced to leave by the military. So that's where the story also begins, right? When they were forcibly asked to leave because they had to avoid the Dutch or maybe the military. So no ID, sorry.
One more question. One more question. One more question. Do you oh, this one is from Alif Yoga Pratama. Morning, Mrs. Maria. My name is Alif Yoga Pratama. I want to ask, in what ways can international norms and human rights frameworks be integrated into ASEAN approach to indigenous rights within regional development? What role can civil society organization and non-governmental organization play in advancing indigenous rights within the Asian framework?
Within the ASEAN framework, that's a good question. Within the ASEAN framework, engaging the I-Chair, the commission, the Human Rights Commission, is one way to really still push for indigenous people's rights recognition. If you recall, and I will give you a copy of my lecture, right now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Free and Prior Informed Consent was mentioned in the guidelines in relation to food security in the ASEAN, but not in the core documents of the ASEAN. The only convention within the ASEAN that is shared right now is the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons. We don't have other shared conventions within the region. So that's one, advocating and engaging through I-Chair, because that's where the CSOs can talk and share. And also to me, if and when Indonesia finally approves and adopts its national law, that would really be a big inspiration for other ASEAN member states, because of your key leadership role in the ASEAN region.
I
Yes.
saw one person who raised their hand. Is there any students want to Akfines? I saw Akfines raise her hand to ask to Mrs. Nero.
Hi, Miss
Yes.
Maria. I want to ask a question. Theory is the main element of the existence of indigenous people in Indonesia. But the fact is, most indigenous peoples have diffusely individually their customary theories because they are formed with fair normative regulation. What are your opinion on that? Thank you, Miss.
Yeah, remember the slide on conflicting laws, right? So you're saying there are other existing regulations, right? That has been one of the reasons why towards the passage and enactment of the Philippine law on indigenous people's rights, some of the advocates were decided to quit because they were not happy with the compromise agreement, the compromise provision that made it into law. And one of the trickier things would be ownership of the land, right? Do you just own the surface of the land? What about the mineral rights? What do you do about that, right? Or what do you do about, for instance, military reservations, or we call them prior vested rights, right? So in a way there were compromises made just so the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the Philippines is enacted into law, right? So for instance, this mountain is, yeah, you can claim that this is your ancestral land, but the portions used by the Catholic priest, you cannot claim that anymore. That was in the law, the concept of prior vested rights. And some indigenous peoples and advocates were not happy about it. But when a group of also non-indigenous Filipinos questioned the constitutionality of the law, they all came together to protect it. I think what we should all learn is that we will never have a perfect law. And this is where really maybe the approach of Aman to go local first, while the national bill is not moving, is a good way to consolidate agreements regionally first. Because there will be a lot of conflicting claims, and there is no one formulation that can solve it. So ultimately, should you remember? There are other rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? Or the provisions there on equality and non-discrimination. So land rights will continue to be contested. But from time to time, when we lose sight of things, we remember the bigger documents, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and non-discrimination, specifically non-discrimination and equal protection. I hope that helps.
Well, that's such a very, very interesting discussion between the lecturer and our students. Again, I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Mrs. Cisnero, Maraming salamat muli.
Terima kasih, Dian.
You're welcome. In conclusion, what I can conclude today is the lecture by our distinguished speaker on a reflection on the possibilities and limits of regional development on indigenous rights discourse in ASEAN has provided us with valuable insight into the complex world of the indigenous rights and regional development within the Asian context. The speaker's comprehensive discussion on the implementation of legal protection and empowerment of indigenous communities has shed light on both the potential for positive change and the challenges that lie ahead. It has become clear that while Asian nations like Indonesia and the Philippines themselves share commonalities in cultural diversity and legal frameworks, there are still significant disparities and limitations when it comes to the actual protection and empowerment of indigenous rights. The presentation underscores the importance of continued collaboration and research across faculties to address these issues, exploring and expanding on the possibilities and limits of regional development in the discourse of indigenous rights should be a priority. By working together, we can strive to bridge the gaps and create more inclusive policies that genuinely protect the rights and empower indigenous community. In closing, I want to express our gratitude to Mrs. Cisnero today for her enlightening lecture and for sharing her expertise with us. This lecture has certainly sparked a call to action, has encouraged all of us to explore further opportunities for cross-faculty collaboration and research in the field of indigenous rights within Asian region. But before we close this lecture, to all participants, please open your web camera. We will take photo together with Mrs. Cisnero. To the students, please open your web camera. Saya minta bantuannya kepada admin untuk memberikan aba-aba foto bersama. We will photo together.
Okay, we will take a picture together. First from the first page. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the second slide. 1, 2, 3. Next, 1, 2, 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and last one. 1, 2, and 3. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to Mrs. Zaitun Abdullah, our first Vice Dean of our Faculty of Law, Pancasila University, who become one of the participants of Mrs. Cisnero lecture, and Ibu Kunti Tridewiyanti, our senior lecturer in Hukum Adat, and Ibu Luhrina Apriyani also. Thank you for your participation for all the students, for all our students, and we look forward to future endeavors in this crucial area of study. Maraming salamat muli. Again, Mrs.
Thank you.
Terima
Miss
kasih.
Maria.
Salamat po.
Yeah, see you.
See you.
Maria for
Indonesia.
the knowledge.
Indonesia.
Thank you, Bu Dian.
Ya, thank
Thank
you.
you, Bu Rina.
Saya tutup perkuliahannya ya.